Right, hello everyone, welcome to Polymath. This week we're going to have David talking about the historical significance of the potato. I've seen this talk before, it's very interesting. I hope you all enjoy it.
Okay, thank you for turning up. I may forget some dates in the middle, so bear with me if I do that, because I can look at that and then tell you the exact dates. So I'll tell you about the significance of potato in human history. Potato. I wanted to bring an actual physical potato, but I couldn't find any around here. So if any of you have never seen a potato before, let me know and I will find you one. I promise. Okay, potato. It's a tuber plant that is very ubiquitous in human society. We eat a lot of those. It grows in 125 different countries. There are more than 5,000 varieties of potatoes scattered around all the continents apart from Antarctica. We grow 368 million tons of potatoes every year. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? And this number may not appeal to you a lot, but to put this into perspective, if you had a 1 meter by 1 meter square and piled all the potato we grow in 1 year into a pillar, the height of the potato will stretch to 87% of the distance from the surface of the Earth to the moon. Isn't that pretty crazy? So yeah, that's yeah. And potatoes also a really big phenomena on the internet. Like it's persistent thing on the internet. There's like a whole bunch of memes that refers to potatoes, and there's also phrases like potato quality, which refers to like really bad quality media. And we also have this really weird obsession, which I do not really understand, with potato cannon. That's from Silicon Valley. You should watch it. It's really fun. But so anyways, where did this magical ball of nutrition come from? Well, let me tell you. There. This is where it comes from. This is the mountain range of Andes in southern Peru and northwestern Bolivia. Like they can't pinpoint exactly where, but just somewhere around that area. So the wild potato strain originated from that area some 13,000 BCE. And it's only since somewhere around 6,500 BC that humans actually started to cultivate potatoes. And that was first cultivated in the Amazon basin. That's where the Amazon River drains, and also where a lot of the civilization in Southern America appeared. And for the next several millennia, a lot of civilization comes and go around that area. Potato spreads throughout the South America. And there's some notable civilizations that depend almost entirely on potato and become really big. And one of those examples is the Inca Empire. So they started in something like 1438 and lasted some 95 years. They were the biggest pre-Columbian empire in American continent, including North and South. They were really famous for their intricate metalwork, especially using gold, and also for their architectural work. That wall there you see comes from Machu Picchu, which is in that photo up there next to the llama. And those walls, even though they've been about 500 years, you can't stick a pocket knife in between the stones because they're so tightly fitted together. So they had like really impressive craftsmanship. And they ate potato, they ate a lot of potato. They grew a wide variety of crops, including carrots, peas, potatoes, sweet potatoes, but their primal source of nutrition was potato. They even had a goddess of potato that they worshipped, which is pretty interesting, I think. And in the years of crop failure, they sustained themselves with, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but what they called chunu. And what this is basically frozen dried powdered potato. So they harvest a bunch of potatoes, they pick out like the really small ones that are easy to dry. They put it on the Andean altiplano, which means like high altitude plain, so that it gets exposed to extreme cold. It freezes, then they put it on sunlight, and then it dries, and then they repeat the process over and over again, and then until it becomes really dry, And then once it does, they smash it up into tiny particles, looking like that. And just like pretty much any other frozen dried food that we see nowadays, that food lasts for a really long time without that much effort. And if you do put adequate effort in preservation, it can last up to a decade, which is pretty impressive. Remember, that's back in like 1500s. So that contributed a lot to their food supply, which allowed them to have a really strong, sustained working class of people, which is probably the reason why they were able to do all these fancy things, because if you don't have enough food, you don't have time to do all those things. You would be growing food and being busy starving. Well, it's true. And just after the Inca civilization meets Spain, Spanish conquistadors, it goes over to Spain. So first of all, when they came over to South America, they encountered Inca people, and they saw the Incans eating potato in the mine as like their snack or whatever. And then the Spanish sailors first started to eat potatoes because it was really easy to preserve and store. And eventually it went to Spanish mainland, where it was grown primarily as food source for the livestock, but not for human consumption yet, because they thought it was like really weird thing. And it also resembled Atrocia belladonna, or the nightshade, which also belongs to the same family as potato. And not sure if you knew, but they are both really poisonous plants, so people kind of avoided potato because they resembled those poisonous things. And for the next century, potato spreads throughout Europe and also to some of the Asian countries because of the European traders and colonists. But there's no real substantial record on any meaningful amount of agricultural harvest of potato in those areas, so we're not gonna look at that for now. To just focus on Europe, European people mainly use potato to feed their livestock and to feed like the really poor and really starving people. But by 1662, the British Royal Society, the science people, were like the first group of people in Europe to actually recognize the value of potato in being able to feed a lot of people. So they started to encourage people to grow potato, but no one really listened. But in a few years, this happened. So in 1688 to 1689, William III and Mary II overthrew King James II and jointly took the throne. That doesn't really matter, but because of the war, there was quite a big food shortage. So the English government decides to officially encourage potato cultivation. So they became like the first European government to really support cultivation of potato. But even then, people were not too keen. I'll explain the reasons in a bit. The next major war, during that time, there were a lot of wars in European continents, primarily because that was when like the big empires started to appear in Europe. But the most important one for us is the 7 Years' War. It started started because of the tension between Prussia and Austria at that time. But other empires in Europe also hopped in for their own interests, basically. But the reason that this war is really important for us is because of this man here. Antoine-Augustin Parmentier was a French military pharmacist during the wartime, but he got captured by the Prussian army in 1760, and he spends 3 years in jail, living mostly on potato because in wartime there's not a lot of food, so you wouldn't feed the prisoners proper food. So they kind of gave him potatoes, which were considered like the inferior food for like the animals and like the uncivilized people, referring to the Incans and other Southern Americans. But luckily, he gets released after 3 years, and to his surprise, he managed to live through the 3 years just eating potato. And he gets really impressed, and so he goes back to Paris, and then he starts to look into nutrition science, specifically studies potato and its nutritious values. And to his sort of luck, I guess, in 1770s, another famine strikes France, like around the whole country. And so the French government decreed a prize for the best essay on the topic of a foodstuff that can minimize the damage of famine. And obviously he submits his amazing eulogy of potato and immediately buys like great support from the French academic society. But he soon realizes that getting support from the academic society doesn't necessarily mean that people actually would eat potatoes. And the biggest reason for that was because the Roman Catholic Church was against potato. This might sound really weird, and well, to be fair, it is really weird. And the reason they were against potato was, there were two reasons. The first one was that it was the food from like the lesser civilization from the Southern America. So they kind of avoided eating what they considered inferior people were eating, which I guess was sort of predominant view at that time. So I guess that's kind of not too strange. But the second reason is really weird. So the other reason they didn't like potato was because it was not on the Bible. So they did not recognize it as like a legitimate food just because it was not in the book. So they kind of criticized potato and called it like the devil's food. And because a lot of people were really into superstitions more than science, they preferred the church's criticism against potato rather than the scientific society's advocation. So in order to persuade those people, he creates a series of public stunts to provoke interest in potato. The first thing he does is in 1785 on Louis 16th birthday. On Louis 16th birthday, he brings like a bouquet of potato flowers and also a bunch of potato cooked dishes. And he basically plotted this with the French king. And so upon endorsement from the king and the queen, the aristocrats who were invited to the banquet ate a lot of potatoes and decorated themselves with potato flowers. And that becomes like a new fashion in the French aristocrats, which soon spreads to other aristocrats in Europe. And he realized just convincing the aristocrats were still not quite enough, so he organizes several potato dinners at his place to sort of advertise different ways that potatoes could be cooked and eaten. Benjamin Franklin was also invited to one of his potato dinner, which I thought was quite interesting. And another really remarkable thing he did was when he won the prize for his potato essay, the king gave him a bunch of soldiers because that's sort of the measure of power back then. And then what he did was he posted every single one of those soldiers to guard his potato farm. And his plan was to get people to be interested in potato because like this new rich guy is protecting this with all these soldiers, there must be something valuable in it. And then, so what happens is when the potato became ready for harvest, he relocated all his soldiers to somewhere else. And as soon as the soldiers disappeared, the peasants just rushed in to steal all the potatoes out of the farm. So through that, he kind of instilled a sense of value and importance in potatoes so that people become more open and accepting to that. And after his effort, the potatoes slowly began to spread in popularity all across Europe. And if you see on the map, even the Middle Eastern area is going red, meaning eating potato. And that's because the Ottoman Empire saw how European Empire was growing really rapidly with the strong working class people population growing because of potato, because it's a really stable and strong food source for those people. So the Ottoman Empire in around 1800s began to adopt potato and started planting them around the Middle Eastern area. But I'm not sure why the click's not working. Oh, there we go. So as we enter 1800s, the potato became a really important food source to fuel the industrial era, because obviously all those factories needed workers to run them, and the majority of the working class were really poor, so they had to live on potatoes. And even by the most conservative estimate, at least 50% of the population growth from 1700s to mid 1800s were attributed to potatoes, so that is quite a substantial amount. But it's soon after there comes a little bit of problem. So near the beginning of 1800s, a potato blight disease begins to spread first in central Mexico, and quickly it goes all the way across the northern America and then reaches Europe. And by 1940, it gets into Ireland, and it stayed there for about 2 years, 1940 and 41. And in those 2 years, about 1 million people starved to death, and another 1 million people had to relocate out of Ireland in search of food, which is pretty substantial back then, because that was about 20 to 25% of the Irish population disappeared in 2 years. So that left a huge impact. Yes?
Wait, is this 1940 or 1840?
Oh, I mean, yeah, 1840. I'm sorry. The reason that potato blight disease was especially devastating for the Irish economy was because, well, there's several reasons, such as like the misunderstanding between the landowners and the peasants, and like the political struggles and all that. But really the most important part of the reason was the property of potato. So there's two ways that potatoes multiply. The first one is the sexual reproduction that most plants do, the pollination of flowers and all that. And the second way that only tuber plants do is they grow a runner or stolon, and when the stolon lands on the ground, it creates another bud, which creates pretty much the same replica of the mother plant, but in different locations, so they're genetically identical. Which means that if you multiply potatoes this way, which was quite widespread back then because they have no genetical diversity, if they happen to be really prone to any diseases, then all of them will be prone to diseases. There's no genetic diversity. And guess what? That's what happened in Ireland. So the clone potato means the potato that grew from asexual reproduction. And unlike most part of Europe and North America, which had a wide mixture of different potatoes, when they encountered blight, they did have some problem, but most of the potatoes survived just fine. But just because the Irish potato were predisposed to those diseases and also really highly replicated, so they were really genetically close, they were almost entirely eradicated at one point, and that was why they couldn't eat anything, because almost all of them were gone. But, wait, let me drink some. That's better. But despite this kind of major problems, potato continues to spread throughout the world through the 1900s. It also becomes a really important food supply during the two world wars, because especially the First World War, that was before the invention of canned food and like widespread manufactured preserved food. So potato was a big part of the army ration. And in 1995, Sputnik reaches out to space. Sputnik, get it? Right, so in 1995, NASA gets interested in developing a food growth program in space so that they can feed their astronauts without having the Earth to send stuff. So that just in case that if they ever launch a really long distance space mission, they were hoping that the astronauts would be able to sustain themselves over a long period of time. And the best candidate they decided for this program was potato. So what happened was they loaded a bunch of potato seed to the Columbia in their in its astrocultural lab, fancy name I think, and they successfully grows potato in space, and it turns out it's also the first plant ever grown in space. So that's another achievement on its own. And in 2007 and 8, during the world food shortage, all of the foods price spiked apart from one, the potato, which kind of made people realize again how important potato is to our society and how valuable it is to kind of sustain humanity as it has been so far. And it was so dramatic to the point that the United Nations decided to recognize year 2008 as the year of potato. This is true. And after this, subsequently, a lot of the UN's food program, where they sort of develop a sustained food supply for third world countries in hunger, there's almost always them teaching about how to harvest and farm potatoes. So it becomes a big part. If you go back to the thing, you can see a lot of the African countries began to grow potato because of those programs. And yeah, so all those people who were starving were now finding kind of ways, because potato grows in pretty much any climate, even in Canada, apparently. But as we enter like the modern era, we kind of started to see the dark side of potatoes. And no, the problem is problem is not necessarily potato itself, but processed potatoes. So like chips, fries, hash browns, whatever you can think of. They were attributed for a lot of health issues such as obesity and heart diseases, because processed potato contains a lot of oil and a lot of sodium, which is obviously not very good for health. And because of this kind of processed potato, we even had a new concept that's just kids eating potato. We even had like a newfound concept of couch potato, which hasn't been around for very long. It's a relatively new concept, and it just shows how devastating potato can be to our health if eaten uncontrollably. So yeah, that's sort of my overview of how potato has been shaping the world so far. And I think I didn't think, when I first started researching this, I didn't think there would be this much material, but apparently potatoes are really important for us. So appreciate potatoes, because they've been really important for us so far, and I think they will be really important for us for at least several decades, if not centuries. Thank you.
Thank you.